Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Courage Conversation Show. I am your host, Ashley Easter. I'm the founder and executive director of Courage 365, and we have a great show planned for you tonight. We have a special guest named Kieryn Darkwater, and it's going to be such a powerful show. We're going to be talking about homeschooling, about how to do it safely, and some of the traps that parents can fall into that can make homeschooling unsafe. So, this is a topic for people whether you are a homeschool graduate, homeschool student, parent, somebody who's thinking about homeschooling. We want to talk about how this can be done safely and how we can avoid any of the pitfalls and traps that people can fall into that make any decision potentially dangerous. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. If you know anybody who homeschools, on your social media page, I would encourage you to hit share on this right now. And if you're watching it through YouTube, you can just click that link at the top and put that into your social media because I really think this is going to be helpful. It's going to help keep families safer. It's going to help keep children safer. So if you'll give this a reshare so other people can tune in and listen to this great information, we would be so thankful for that, and I really think you won't be sorry. All right, so let me read a quick bio from Kieryn real quickly. Kieryn Darkwater is the Interim Executive Director of the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. They are the eldest child in a quiverful family of 8 and were homeschooled K through 12 in the South. Kieryn co-founded CRHE in 2013 with several other homeschool alumni to raise awareness and combat educational deprivation and abuse of homeschool kids. CRHE conducts research and provides information and resources to homeschooling families, alumni, and anyone who wants to learn about homeschooling. They currently live in Berlin, Germany, and co-host the podcast with Christian fundamentalist Impact on Today's Politics with Eve Ettinger called Kitchen Table Cult. So this is going to be a really important conversation. We'll be back right after this quick break.
Talk about it. I was told not to talk about it.
So I'm here to talk about it.
Because I can't stay quiet.
I was able to break my silence.
Because of those who refuse to stay quiet.
I am a businesswoman.
Activist.
Survivor.
Survivor. Survivor.
Anxiousness can strike at any time, while driving a car, in the middle of the night, when giving a work presentation, or in a crowded place. Introducing CalmiGo, a smart calming device that learns your personal breathing patterns and adapts to you for immediate relief in just 3 minutes. It quiets your senses through breathing regulation, multisensory stimulation, and calming scents. Don't stress another moment. Click the Learn More button and start using CalmiGo today.
Hey Kieryn, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So happy to have you on the show. And I know we actually connected, I don't know, was that 2 weeks ago? Something like that. Just as two executive directors of organizations helping people. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you have to come on the show. You have so much wisdom and knowledge, and you have a passion for keeping people safe, just like I do. And so this is going to be great.
I'm very excited.
Oh, great. Awesome. So one thing that I just wanted to kind of kick things off with is there are a lot of different organizations that are out there that position themselves in a way that they say they're going to help homeschool children or homeschooling parents. And some of them are good. A lot of them, as we've run into in our own experiences growing up, I'm also a homeschool alumni, they're not always that good. And so you decided to start an organization that was all about the safety and equipping parents and children so homeschooling can be responsible. So I know I read a little bit about this in the bio, but can you talk a little bit more about your organization?
Yeah. So the Coalition for Responsible Home Education Started in 2013. It's the only organization founded and run by homeschool alumni advocating for homeschooled students.
Mm.
And that's what separates us from organizations like HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which is run by homeschool parents for homeschool parents and led by parental rights extremists.
Mhm.
They do not care about the safety of homeschool children, only the complete and total authority of their parents.
Mm.
And so that was sort of the only organization that existed nationwide when I was homeschooled growing up, and all of the other alumni of us who started CRHE were also members of this organization, or our parents were members rather. And we realized that there was a complete discrepancy between
Mm.
what we were promised as homeschooled students with regards to our education and what the reality was.
Yeah.
And what we were promised was that we would be, eons ahead of our peers and totally well educated and equipped to do literally everything. And the reality was that was true for some of us. But a lot of us, and I know you're aware of this, uh, did not get that experience. And instead, our educations were neglected or we were completely deprived of education. And for those of us in Cooperville families, and even some of us who weren't necessarily part of the Cooperville movement, but were still very conservative, a lot of that discrepancy fell on a gender line.
Mhm.
So people who were assumed to be girls, for instance, were trained only to be wives and mothers and not have any skills that would help them survive adulthood outside of the home. And that's wrong. It's just wrong. That's it.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
shouldn't be that way. And so a bunch of us found each other through blogging about our experiences and realized that we weren't alone. We were like, this really needs to change. How do we do it? So we started a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating the public about it, because something that we realized as we were going through is that when we were talking to people who weren't homeschooled and didn't know a homeschooler except for us, they were like, well, obviously you're smart, or you kind of get the two tropes of either like, well, you're super smart and talented, or you were raised in the boonies with guns. And there is a vast spectrum between those
Right.
two where most people fall. And we were like, well, we need to fix this, because we can't solve the problem if people don't know it's a problem and if people's only understanding of the problem is two very different stereotypes.
Right.
So we do research on homeschooling, which is, I'm sure we'll get into the complicatedness of research later,
Yeah.
but it's very complicated. And we create resources for homeschool alumni and homeschool parents. The resources for homeschool alumni are geared more towards, okay, so you graduated and now graduated, air quotes,
Mhm.
and now what do you do? And then for homeschool parents, we're like, okay, so you want to homeschool your kid, you want to do it well. Here is how you make sure that you're doing the best that you can, because you can't, and I know we'll get into this in a minute too, but there's no set standard across the
Yeah.
US for education for homeschoolers. So you can't always rely on your state's guidelines for homeschooling to tell you whether or not you're doing a good job, because in many, many cases that doesn't exist. So what we do is we write up guidelines of like, here are some benchmarks. Here's how you can think about your child's education in order to do it very well.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we do is we work with media and legislators and literally anyone else who wants to learn and wants to help. And for legislators, we have policy recommendations like, here are things that work. Here is what responsible parents who are equipping their children well are already doing.
Mm.
And it's not an extra burden.
Yeah.
And for everyone else, we're just like, here's all of the information. Go have fun.
Right. Right. I think that's so important. All the work that you're doing And I love how you distinguish yourself from a lot of the other organizations. And that is that this is actually homeschool alumni, graduates who are the ones who are saying these are our experiences of being homeschooled. And some homeschooling students had a great experience. Those people's stories do exist. And so you're not saying that homeschooling must be done away with for everyone, as I'm sure you get painted like that's what you do
Yeah.
in the media a lot of
Yep.
times, conservative media. But it's more so like we need to look into the actual experiences of people coming through homeschooling curriculums, through homeschooling families and communities, and make sure that other children are getting quality educations in safe environments. And I
Exactly.
think the downfall of many other organizations, not just in the homeschool realm, but a lot of times we tend to have organizations created by those in power versus those who have been powerless and having their
Hmm.
voices elevated in the movements. And I even think of what I've been learning about the autism community and how a lot of the organizations there were started by people who did not have autism but had autistic children. And certainly those people deserve to have communities where they can have understanding with other parents, but it's not the same as having an organization with the lived experiences of people who actually have autism and what their
Yeah.
wishes and desires are. And I look at that the same here in the homeschooling movement. It is important for parents who are homeschooling their children to have support systems, but it's super important to elevate the voices of people who, again, were powerless in these movements, to be able to talk about their experiences and add validity to maybe it was super easy on this mom or dad and they loved homeschooling because they just threw some books at you and didn't do anything. But what is the
Yeah.
experience of the student there? And so being able to hear those voices, center those voices, is something that I do think had long been missing from the conversation. And so I love that your organization focuses on that. And yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And if anybody is listening to this and isn't familiar with the term quiverful, um, I also came from a quiverful styled family. And so I just want to quickly, for anybody tuning in who hasn't heard that term, though I think a lot of our audience is familiar, basically, there's a scripture in the Old Testament that's really taken out of context in the book of Psalms about how children are like arrows in a mighty man's quiver. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. And so basically, the idea is for you to be a blessed man, you should try to have as many children as possible, which are the arrows in your quiver, and you shoot them out into the world to they sink into different sectors of society, the home, the church, schools, politics, media. Isn't there two more? I don't know.
Yeah. I don't
I can't
remember what they are though, but
all the
everything that you
different
can think of.
places.
Yeah. All
And then
of the
they,
pies. Just
yes, yes. And then they dominate the world through overpopulation with these messages of patriarchal ideals. Um, anyway, so if you weren't familiar with that term, that's kind of what we were alluding to earlier. Just wanted to clear that up a little bit. But later on in the show, I do want to talk about some tips for parents who want to create safe environments for their children while homeschooling. But I think before we can really talk about that, we have to talk about some of the dangers and some of the pitfalls. And so I think probably a lot of our listeners are familiar with some of these stories, but there have been stories that have popped up in the media over the last, I would say, 10 years or so of really horrific abuse cases. And they've been linked very clearly to homeschooling movement. And a lot of these cases are more extreme than you generally hear, being chained to beds and, deprived of food on purpose, just a lot of very torturous scenarios. And I guess what I want to ask you about is we know abuse happens in every environment. And before we have people coming on and saying, well, abuse happens in public schools too. Yes, it does. But we're here to talk about our experiences today in homeschooling and the experiences of other homeschooled people. So that's what we're focusing on today. We're not saying it doesn't happen in other places. But it does seem like some of the more extreme cases often happen under the umbrella of homeschooling. And so my question to you is, abuse can happen anywhere, but there are some loopholes within the homeschooling movement across the country. And why would you say so many of these abuses go unchecked? What are those loopholes? What do we need to understand about what are the unique dangers to this particular movement?
That is a great question, and there are so many answers to that question. But I will start with the biggest, which is that in 48 states, if you are a convicted child abuser, you are still allowed to homeschool.
Wow.
And this happens frequently.
Hmm.
And I feel like you don't really need a lot of imagination to see how
Yeah.
exactly that's bad. So I'm not going to get into a lot of that. But that's in 48 states. There are only 2 states in the US where that is not the case. And I don't remember what they are off the top of my head. And the other, that's just like the first thing.
Right.
The other
And
thing
that's
is
a pretty
that
big one. That's a very big one.
that's sort of like the biggest.
The
Like if
biggest.
we were going to fix one thing and one thing only, it would be that. Like,
Yeah.
let's not let people who are convicted of child abuse homeschool their children because they will just continue to do it.
Yes.
Second to that is that, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier about homeschooling being regulated differently in every state. The requirements for homeschooling vary significantly. So in a lot of places, you don't have to notify the state that you're homeschooling. You can just withdraw your child or never send your child to school. And if a truancy officer comes up, you can just be like, well, I'm homeschooling, and they can't do anything about it. In places where you do have to notify the state, many states don't have any follow-up to that. Like it's a one-time letter of intent, nothing
Yeah.
else. You don't have to resubmit. You don't have to have an assessment. You don't have to show any paperwork. Vaccines aren't necessarily required. So it is very, and I could go on, it's a very long list, but it is very, very easy for parents who are abusing their children to use homeschooling to hide that abuse because there is nobody to follow up on. In 2014, I believe, there was a study done in Connecticut that showed that there was a significant amount of people who'd had CPS called on them at least once before, had withdrawn their kids from school. And these are like abuse cases. And what happens when you withdraw your child from school after CPS is called and there's no other action taken is, if abuse is still occurring, it continues to happen and there is nobody to follow up. And a lot of times also parents use homeschooling where if abuse is found, they withdraw their child.
Right.
So they don't have to deal with CPS. And that just completely, CPS has no authority after that because it was called in by the school. So then you have to have another report from a family member or friend or neighbor or somebody to send them in again, which often doesn't happen because people are afraid of conflict.
Right. And in other scenarios, there's such a thing as mandatory reporters, whereas in many states, people are not mandatory reporters unless they hold particular positions. I think there are maybe some states with exceptions to that where any adult is a mandatory reporter to certain crimes. But in a lot of states, doctors are mandatory reporters, teachers are mandatory reporters. Um, and so if you aren't around mandatory reporters very much, yeah, there's
Exactly.
not a
And
lot of
that's
possibility that someone will report if something.
that was the other loophole I was going to bring up was mandatory reporters are not like you there's no law requiring that homeschooled students have to see doctors or have to, have checkups. And so if your parents are homeschooling and abusive, they simply aren't held to the same standards of care as public
Mm,
school parents or traditionally schooled parents. So you don't get seen by a
right.
doctor. So you don't have that person to report. And there's just so many ways that homeschool kids fall through these cracks. And there are so many. And we can't even track all of them because not like we don't even have data requirements. Like parents don't even have to say that they're homeschooling. If they do, they don't even necessarily have to say like how many kids they're homeschooling or
Right.
what their ages are. So there is just this huge swath of the population that is being isolated from anyone who could help. And
Yeah.
abusive parents are actively using that to continue to abuse their children without getting caught.
Mm, wow. Yeah, I think um, all of those loopholes are shocking but true. And I even know from my experience, I think we claimed something like religious exemption. And so if, I don't recall everything, but I'm pretty sure we sent like one letter in and said, we're doing this. And I don't think even all my siblings were born at that time. And so I don't think those were checked in. And then um, other systems often overlap with these. So I know that home births can be a really empowering choice for some women. Um, and they can be a safe choice for some women. Um, Granted that you have the right support and midwives and all those types of things. But there are some people in this movement who will do things like home births, they'll do it in ways that are not safe. And they'll also decide not to get documentation that their children even exist. And then
Yep.
on top of that, their children don't have to have that documentation because they're not going to some sort of a public school or private school. And then also, sometimes those families don't take them to the doctor or don't take them very often. And so, maybe you could talk a little bit about even your experiences running into students who maybe don't have like a birth certificate or don't have social security card. What is that like when these children grow up and don't have those documents?
Well, it's really funny that you laid out that situation because that is exactly my childhood.
Mm,
Um, so I was born before my parents went hard to the right, but my siblings, my middle siblings, were unassisted home births, no documentation. My parents, by when I was like 7,
mm.
um, joined a cult, and in that cult, decided that doctors are literally practicing witchcraft. So we didn't see
Gosh.
any doctors while I was growing up. Uh, and it wasn't until this year that my undocumented siblings got documentation.
Mm,
And this is not an uncommon thing. We see it a lot. We call this identification abuse. And
mm,
it's what happens when, and it sometimes it happens when parents don't bother getting ID when the child was
mhm,
born for whatever reason, or they do have ID and they aren't giving it to their child
mm.
because they want to control that child into adulthood.
Got it.
So the second one is trickier to deal with. The first one is mostly a long legal process and it varies by state, but every state has a mechanism that you can apply for a delayed birth certificate.
Mm,
And sometimes that is just handled by some affidavits by people who are present at your birth.
Mm.
Sometimes there's a longer court hearing, but you mostly need, someone to say that, yes, you were born on the day that you were born, and I was there, and I am willing to testify under oath to that
Right.
effect. And then
Even that is
bureaucratic
shocking
machinations ensue.
because
Yeah,
obviously you were born. I mean,
right.
like, um, why do we need proof of that? And what if that person is no longer living or can't be contacted or doesn't want to cooperate? And is that process have a monetary cost?
It does, and it varies
Got it.
by state and situation. I know my parents lucked out, and they found, and you have to do it in the state and with the county that you were born in. So if you
Got
don't
it.
know where you were born, then that's a whole other
Oh,
set of
wow.
problems.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know how common that aspect of it is.
Right.
I haven't heard anything, but another level of
Sure.
complication. But my parents found a judge who was like, "Oh, there's four of you that need this stuff. Since you're all the same family, I will just say yes, you exist." And kind of just like handled all that paperwork at
Wow.
once. But my family got lucky with that.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it can be an individual process, and it's still this. My parents started doing this in 2018, 2019,
Okay.
and it's taken until this year for everyone
Wow.
to get their birth certificates
Mm.
and social security numbers so they can get their, driver's licenses and state
Wow.
IDs and whatnot.
Wow.
It
Wow.
also doesn't help because usually, in most cases, again, if you're not homeschooled and you don't have a birth certificate, your school records or your medical records will show and will add to your proof. But
Yeah.
if you're isolated and homeschooled, you don't have those. So there's
Mhm.
more steps
Right.
that just vary depending on your state and county requirements
Yeah.
to get through that. So it's just a very complicated, bureaucratic, and not free
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
If you do have documentation and your parents are withholding it, and you, for whatever reason, can't grab it from the lockbox or get your
Mhm.
parents to give it to you some other way, you can request a duplicate or a
Yeah.
copy from the county that you were born
Mhm.
in. And there is another process for you to request a duplicate or supplemental. Like if you lost your social security card,
Right.
you
Right.
can replace another one. And that's also a bureaucratic process. But I don't know if it costs. I think like the first time is maybe free for
Mhm.
your first lost social security, and
Right.
after that is iffy. And
Got
then I think for requesting your birth certificates, it's like the filing fee plus
Right.
whatever county fees.
Got it.
So if you have those, it's easier because you don't have to go through the whole court
Right.
process of proving that you exist. But it's still bureaucratic
Yeah.
headache.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, what I see highlighted here in our conversation so far is that it really is on a spectrum what abuse can look like and what loopholes are there. So, we do have some of the cases that we see on the news with just some horrific, really torture types of treatments, and that can happen. And there are loopholes that make it more likely for it to happen in an environment where children are isolated and not seen by mandatory reporters at school.
Hmm.
On the other end of the spectrum, you may have other forms of emotional abuse, control, those types of things that don't leave bruises, but are keeping documents away from adult children to really start their lives. There could be lack of oversight with education or no education at all. Um, I know a problem that I ran into was I did really well in science, but then I found out the science books that I had were teaching a lot of things that were not true. And so
Yeah.
that can
Yeah.
also be a thing that you're being
Yep.
given history or science information that's inaccurate. Um, or parents can even be well-meaning but not be equipped to perhaps teach their child higher math. So it seems like it's a big spectrum of ways that there can be deficits. And it's not to say that there aren't deficits, loopholes, cracks that people can fall into in other systems, but because there's so little oversight, it seems like the homeschooling movement really has a lot of maybe additional ways that can happen.
Absolutely.
And it's harder to kind of catch those things because there may not be any oversight. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And that's something that we got a lot when we started was people are like, well, but like, why not focus on public schools? Public schools are bad. Why are you targeting homeschoolers? It's like, well, public schools already have oversight. There are already many, many organizations and resources and state and federal funding dedicated to ensuring that public school children have access to education, access to food, access to healthcare, access to counseling and mandatory reporters.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, kids still fall through the cracks, and that's still bad. And public school students still are abused, and they still get beaten, and they still show up with bruises on their body. And all of that is terrible and awful. But they aren't as isolated and completely and entirely cut off
Mm-hmm.
from social support like homeschoolers are. And the reason that we're focusing on homeschoolers, besides the fact that we ourselves were homeschooled, is because there's nothing.
Right.
There is no state funding to ensure that homeschooled students have access to the same things that public school students have. There is no one who can check up on homeschooled students to make sure that they're alive, which is why you see all of the horrific abuse and death cases.
Yeah.
And there's just both of these problems exist simultaneously, and focusing on one does not mean the other does not exist, and does not mean that the other shouldn't be solved. They are
Right.
both problems that should be solved at the
Right,
same
right.
time.
It's like, don't shame people for talking about breast cancer, and maybe not focusing on testicular cancer because their mom passed away because of breast cancer. Like, doesn't mean
Right.
you're saying that testicular cancer doesn't exist or that brain cancer doesn't exist. It's like, this is something that I need to talk about. And bringing that a step further, maybe it's a type of cancer that doesn't have research and funding to help. It
Yep.
doesn't invalidate other people's experience to talk about your own experiences.
Yeah.
They can exist together and both be true at once.
My favorite thing to say that I actually do have on a t-shirt is multiple things can be true at the same time.
Yes.
It's a hard concept, I know.
I love that. Yeah, that's very good. And we are going to take a quick break and come back, but I want to talk a little bit about socialization, the big question that always comes up for homeschoolers. So everybody stay tuned. Make sure you give this a share, and we will be back in just a few minutes.
Anxiousness can strike at any time, while driving a car, in the middle of the night, when giving a work presentation, or in a crowded place. Introducing Calmigo, a smart calming device that learns your personal breathing patterns and adapts to you for immediate relief in just 3 minutes. It quiets your senses through breathing regulation, multisensory stimulation, and calming scents. Don't stress another moment. Click the Learn More button and start using Calmigo today.
Hey everyone, we are back with Kieryn Darkwater, and we are talking about homeschooling. Right now, we've been talking a bit about some of the dangers that can be found within homeschooling, and in a bit, we're going to talk about some ways that homeschooling parents can keep their children safe and do things in a way that are very ethical. But right now, we're going to talk about socialization. I know that was a huge topic. When I was being homeschooled, that was always coming up. I remember people writing books about it. People always asked us questions about it. But I want to talk about this because it's still a conversation that needs to be had. And I actually had an experience the other day. I was in a online conversation with a homeschool mom, and they made some sort of like a TikTok, Instagram reel kind of thing about like socialization. That's not a problem for us. Look at our calendar. We have so many activities. I was never this busy when my kids were in public school. And I had a little bit of a conversation, and it didn't really go anywhere. But one of the things that really came up for me is I think a lot of times when we talk about socialization of homeschooling students, parents are quick to say that's not an issue. And then they make false equivalencies. They say, well, they have a full schedule. They are playing soccer with other homeschool students, or they are taking violin lessons with this person from the church. Or, look, my child has started 2 home businesses before they were 16. I know for myself, I was a high achieving homeschool student, not so much academically, but in performance. So,
Hmm.
I sang in front of the church. I wrote a book and had it published with a small publishing company by the time I was 17. I graduated when I was 16. I had an international ministry where we sent scarves that we hand knitted all over the world to children in need. I had, let's see, what else? I had a cake decorating business. I had a business where I was selling little goods that I had made. I had my own website, and I had a blog where I wrote to 3,500 women about adherence to the patriarchy. And people could really easily look at all that and be like, see how socialized she is. And yet, when I got into the real world, when I kind of left that movement, there were so many cultural references I did not understand. There were so many things in the world that I had no idea existed or that I needed to understand how they worked. There were a lot of conversations that were hard for me to have with peers um, because it was very difficult relating. And I realized for myself that being high achieving visually to other people and having a busy schedule doesn't mean I had well rounded socialization. And I guess I using this to kind of share my story example, but I know that you hear that all the time working in the organization that you work with. And so talk to me about what is quality socialization. Talk to me about maybe some of these false equivalents, and is it really an issue still today? Or was I sort of like the graduating class that, it's no longer an issue anymore? Like that was just old school homeschooling.
I wish. No, it is definitely still a problem that we are having. And the reason is, and this is what I've gathered after being out for like 15 years, is when you're like, my parents did this thing where they were like, well, you don't need to make friends with kids your age because you're never going to work with people your age. You're going to work with people older than you or younger than you. And like, my age group was just people I would never interact with. Apparently, like everyone born in 91 is just written off. Like, okay.
You'll never bump into people that were born in
Never,
your birth
never,
year.
not a single time in my life at all. No.
Certainly not
So,
the workplace.
no, definitely not. So, imagine my shock when my first job at 18 was with other 17 and 18-year-olds, and I had no clue what they were even talking about. Like, I was 18 and married. My coworkers were 18 and graduating high school and having their like fun summer before college. I was like trying to run a whole house,
Yeah.
which these two experiences are not the same.
No,
Just
no.
just saying, not even close. And they're talking about like all these TV shows and singers and whatever that I'd never heard of, had no idea. Like, what is prom? What is homecoming? Is there a difference between the two? Why does it matter who gets the crown on this thing and not on this thing? I still don't know. Maybe I'll eventually figure that out. But my parents and the homeschool community I grew up in was like, well, you will like it's better for you to experience, being able to relate to people across all age differences. And to some extent, yes, we should be able to interact with people across the age spectrum. However, this is very important, not to the exclusion of our own peer group, which is the group that we will be working with for most of our lives.
Right, right.
And the other thing, because I had a very active online social life growing up, and I wrote a magazine and had a blog and did all these really cool things, and I went and campaigned for people all over the Southeast, and
Yep.
had a very active social life.
Mhm.
um Socializing with people who think exactly the same as you and your parents do doesn't count.
Right.
Like it fills that social need like on the Sims bar, but it's not the same as quality socialization. What I learned, and I didn't learn this until after I got divorced when I was 25 and moved to the Bay Area and started making friends with people in person who didn't grow up homeschooled.
Right.
People who go to public school or private school or normal school interact with a lot of people every day who have wildly different experiences.
Yeah.
And so they learn how to navigate social relationships with people who don't look and think and believe exactly the same thing they do.
Yeah.
And they learn how to have reasonable disagreements without it becoming a huge, like, salvation level friendship issue.
Right. Yeah.
And this is something I had to learn when I was 25. Like, most people learn this when they're teenagers.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I learned this well into early adulthood. And I felt so behind because I was like, I like figuring out how to navigate conflict when you're 25 and all of your other peers have already figured out that like one person not liking Harry Potter is not the end of the world. Like
Exactly.
it's fine actually. It's
Yeah.
okay, you will live. You can disagree
Yeah.
on this thing. And it's not even just like I'm pulling Harry Potter out because it's easy,
Sure.
but like it can be anything. Like
Yeah.
the way that I was raised to put like things that I was interested in
Mm.
as like sort of a really important
It's like your core
level.
identity almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to have someone who doesn't feel that way felt like an
Mhm.
attack on my identity.
Right. Yeah. Like, I like
And I
Southern
had to
gospel
learn.
music, and so that is who I am. I am Ashley Easter Southern gospel music. It was, well, it was
Right.
more at the time, but
Exactly.
like,
Yeah.
it's, you don't like Southern gospel? Like, what? Who are you even?
We
Like,
can't be friends, obviously.
right?
Yeah. Right. And that's like
Mm.
not how anyone else on the planet works. Like
Right.
everyone else who's a, you know, decent at being
Yeah.
social has figured out boundaries between self
Mm.
and
Mm.
likes and other people and likes, and realizing that likes and
Mm.
hobbies and even like beliefs that aren't core to your identity, like trans
Yeah.
people being valid, like you can get along if you don't
Right.
agree on everything, and you
Right.
don't
Right.
have to like shun the unbeliever because you listen to different kinds of
Right.
music.
Yeah. And I think they do that because, at least in my experience, pretty much everything was very black and white in that, like, it's good or bad. And
Hmm.
so for you to, I think it can be hard to separate, like you said, what truly are core issues, like accepting people who maybe have a different gender identity than you. Like, that should be a core value.
Exactly.
But certain likes or dislikes, green beans, I don't like them. Like, that's not something to unfriend someone over kind of thing.
Exactly, exactly.
Um,
And it's that kind of
mm,
level that when you're only exposed to people who align perfectly with your family's
mhm.
values, you don't ever get that experience
Yeah,
of being friends despite differences, or if you do, it's a very limited experience. Like my parents had this really fun thing that they did where they would like split my speech and debate club and like get kicked out of churches because churches didn't believe in faith healing the same way that my
Oh
parents did. And I
God.
figured out how to be friends with my friends even when our parents were not talking,
Mhm.
but on things that were different
Mhm.
scale than that. And it was also easy because on everything else they were exactly the same. But
Right.
when I was interacting with people who came from different faith backgrounds, who had
Yeah.
completely different life experiences, who
Mhm.
went to public school, like bridging those gaps was
Mm.
something I had to figure out how to navigate. And it was very
Right.
hard at first because I just didn't have the tools. And I had to spend a lot of time sitting down with myself and deconstructing that right or wrong, black and
Mhm.
white binary, and
Yeah.
realizing, okay, what are the things that really matter to me?
Yeah.
And does this other extraneous stuff fit in it?
Mhm.
No? Okay,
Yeah.
then I don't have to worry about that. But that was like
Right.
a long and intentional process.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm just kind of like trying to boil this down in my mind. So I think, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just kind of spitballing here. It seems like socialization um, is not having friendships and knowing a variety of people. Socialization in a well rounded way, well, that is maybe a part of it. Well rounded socialization is giving you the opportunity to interact with different types of scenarios. So you are well able as an adult to navigate relationships in a way that causes you to be functional in society. Um, so you can reduce conflict, so you can know how to negotiate, um, with other people and set boundaries for yourself. And it's socialization, it seems to me, is less about, hey, I have 17 friends who all think the same as me, and we've never had any conflict that translates into the real world, versus I have maybe 5 friends and all of them are different. And, I learned how to, oh, that hurt somebody's feelings. I'm learning how to pull that back because I don't want to do that again. Or my feelings are hurt. How can I mend this
Hmm.
relationship? Or we're different. And so it's more like the functional skills that you learn versus just being busy and having people around you. Does that
Exactly.
seem
There
like,
is a difference between an echo chamber and socialization.
got it? Got it.
Yeah. And
That's a really good way to put it. Yes.
only
Okay.
seeing people like you as an echo chamber, that is
Yes.
not the same as socialization.
Yes. That's really, really good. And then one question I have, and then I want to kind of finish up before some of my last ones here. And it's just when you were talking about how at your first job, you couldn't relate to people your own age when they were talking about pop culture references, songs, celebrities, those types of things. I have heard many times parents or non homeschool people be like, oh, well, that stuff is just not important. And it's okay that you missed that. And it seems to me that that is overlooking that it's not. It sounded to me, and I'm hoping you can expound on this, sounded to me not that it was so much that you hadn't heard of Beyonce before in particular, but was more, it went deeper than that. Why does it feel, what does it feel like when you can't relate to your peers, even on
Yeah.
quote unquote surfacey, doesn't matter stuff?
Yeah, it's not so much that it's the specific thing, it's that it is a cultural touchstone. It
Mm,
is something that everyone in your generation can like knows happens.
right.
And so it's really isolating when you like grow up, like I grew up in the 90s. And so like Harry Potter was a huge thing
Yeah,
growing up, and I wasn't allowed to partake in it because it was evil and magic. And
same.
so everyone I know is talking about Harry Potter, and it's less about Harry Potter existing and me not being able to read it than it is about the fact that there is a cultural touchstone that everyone else in my generation knows, and there is a shorthand and there are analogies and references that people make that
Yeah.
I did not understand that meant stuff.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
missed the meaning, not because it was a movie or a book,
Right.
but because it was a cultural touchstone. And removing
Right.
access to cultural touchstones is so hugely isolating and damaging in a way that I learned about Prince when he died,
Right.
which is really kind of messed up.
Yeah. I think I
And
learned about
all of my
him when he
friends
died
were
too.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. Like every single time a celebrity dies, all of my homeschool friends are like, "Oh, I'm just now learning about this person. Where have I been?" It's like, right, I grew up
Exactly.
under a rock. And
Yeah.
it's really kind of like it's hard because on one hand, like we see all of our other peers
Hmm.
mourning the loss of a really cool artist, and
Right.
we have no like we can't even be sympathetic because we're like,
Right.
what?
Who tell
Who?
us? Yeah.
What?
Exactly. Yeah. It's more like the
And
loss of
so
connection versus the thing that you're connecting over.
exactly, that's exactly
Got
what
it.
it is.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. That's really helpful. Well, we've talked most of the show about some of the pitfalls and some of the things to look out for. But I kind of want to wrap things up with what are some markers of safe homeschooling environments? What does quality homeschooling choices look like? Because I know that we have people who maybe want to homeschool their kids for a variety of reasons. Maybe they have a compromised immune system and it's not safe for them to be in, a big public school setting all the time. Or maybe they have a learning disability and it's better for them to have tutors at home for them. There's a lot of different reasons that are legitimate, healthy, and useful. But while I see sometimes parents start homeschooling with good intentions, not always, but a lot of times with good intentions, there's so much bad information out there. Like, what would you point to? What would you say are markers of safety, quality home education?
That is an excellent question, and something that we spent a lot of time on at CRHE is developing a guide for home educators to help them answer that question. Because obviously, homeschooling at its best provides an individual style learning option to the betterment and empowerment of the child.
Yeah.
And my like the first thing that I always tell people is if you're homeschooling, why? What is your reason? If you are homeschooling because you are doing so out of fear or out of a sense of needing to control your child, don't do it. That
Yeah.
is only going to end bad because your motivation isn't in the right place. If you are homeschooling because it is legitimately what is best for your child, and I think we haven't seen a lot of evidence about this yet, but given the way that Florida and Texas are moving, I think if we don't see parents fleeing the state, we're going to see more parents homeschooling their queer kids because that's safer for them and that will
Mm,
keep their family together. And that's fine. And so if you're doing that, again, like you said, people homeschool for good reasons and then it sort of falls apart because
yeah.
the information out there is terrible. That was sort of the gateway drug for my family is a bunch of the
Mhm.
mainstream curriculum is revisionist, white nationalist, Christian
Yeah.
supremacist bullshit for lack
Yeah.
of a better term. It is
Right. Right.
not
Oh,
worth
and
it.
one thing that I just thought of that loops in from
Yeah.
our last question. Um, Am I correct in understanding that a lot of times when people started the homeschooling movement itself, that it started because of fear of segregation ending in schools? And so there was sort of the white panic and pulling them out, putting them either in homeschool or private school. And so the
Yeah.
fear and the
That
that
is
segregation is
definitely a
kind of
big
were a
part of it.
base of
Hmm.
the beginnings of the movement.
Yeah, definitely a lot of the like founding leadership of the
Hmm.
movement um happened around the same time as desegregation,
Mhm.
and white supremacy is just sort of like the undercurrent
Right, right.
of the modern homeschooling movement. And a lot of that is changing slowly, but we cannot erase and should not erase the impact that racism plays in homeschooling and it taking off. And second to that,
Mhm.
also homeschooling and the moral majority and their attack on the Equal Rights Amendment and
Yep,
Roe
yep,
are very tightly linked.
yes.
Because
Yeah.
if you want to raise an army to bring
Shoot
Jesus
those arrows,
to
shoot
the
those arrows.
U.S.,
Yes.
you got to do it through homeschooling
Yeah,
because if your kids are exposed to other ideas, they might not agree with yours, which
exactly.
is the entire basis for the parental rights extremist
Right.
movement that we've been seeing with all of the anti-CRT and anti-LGBT laws are
Mhm.
coming from the parental rights extremists.
Yep,
Michael Ferris is a huge force behind that, which
yep,
is not shocking, I'm sure.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, there is racism and
Mhm.
misogyny are like the
Right.
lovely core
Yeah,
of this
the base
this
of the
problem
movement.
that we have.
Yeah. And so it seems
Yeah,
like one of the qualities of safe quality homeschooling is reckoning with the history of it and moving forward in a different direction. Do you think?
exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, and finding materials that are not written by revisionist historians
Mhm. Mhm.
or Christian publishing houses. So we have put together a very uh, thorough guide on how to set a learning outcome for your
Mm.
student. What that will look like for each family is different
Yeah.
because every child has different needs,
Right.
obviously. So if you have a child with a learning disability, it's going to like the success markers are going to look different than a child without a learning disability, for instance. So we don't have like a your child must read by the age of 10, like
Right,
even though
right.
that's a pretty good general rule,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
don't have anything that stringent, but it's like given your situation, here is how you can think about making sure that learning is progressing. Here is
Mhm.
how you can tell if you are falling short
Yeah.
or if you need additional support. Here is how to build your own curriculum that is not written
Mm.
by Christian nationalists.
Yeah.
Um, here are very like there are various kind of online programs and
Mhm.
resources available now. We have a whole page at least of resources on teaching your kids about race and not having whitewashed history of the Civil
Mm.
War and like getting like we have a bunch of resources from black people and people of color on
Yeah.
history and all of the things. We have how to keep records well, because not every state has record keeping requirements.
Mhm.
And if your kid wants to go to college, eventually you're going to need to have some kind of record.
Yeah.
And so we have a guide on how to create records. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to take the SAT every how many years. It's like, here
Right.
is how you can do testing. Here's how you can build a portfolio. Here's how to build out a transcript. Because many states don't certify homeschool diplomas because homeschoolers aren't part of the school system. So getting a
Mhm.
diploma is a thing. There's also no one to check your diploma.
Right.
So here is how like we have a literal template that is a
Mhm.
diploma template that you can print out and sign, and
Mhm.
most places will be like, yes, okay. And
Mhm.
if you've been doing it well and you've been keeping your records and your child is,
Mhm.
actually learning,
Yeah.
then that is a valid diploma and you shouldn't be afraid to use it.
Right.
So I will send you the link to it. It is a really
Okay.
thorough guide on just how to do it well. We have an entire section on identifying your educational philosophy. We talk about
Okay.
unschooling. We talk about all of the
Mm.
different, like, from like kind of very not strict. Uh, there's a word that I am completely blanking, but a more structure, that's the
Sure.
word.
Yeah.
From a more structured approach to an unstructured approach, here are like sort of philosophies. Here's how
Yeah.
you can use them. There's obviously like a whole spectrum in between. So we have just basically a complete guide for homeschool parents who want to do this well. And if you have any questions about anything in that guide, please feel free to reach out and we will happily work with you to explain or make it easier to understand
Right.
or whatever it is that you need.
That's wonderful. And I definitely want to include those links. So please, by the time everybody's listening, we'll have the links to be able to share those below because that sounds really useful. And like we talked about in the beginning of the show, um, there are so many resources created by homeschooling parents with agendas for homeschooling parents. But ultimately, at its core, homeschooling, if you choose to do that, should be for the empowerment, betterment of your student. So let's talk to an organization who's compiled things by homeschool students that they trust and know would have been or is helpful in their homeschooling journey, maybe with children that they have moving forward, they may choose to homeschool. Yeah, that's really helpful, and I really want everybody to check out that resource for sure. And I guess I'll just have two last questions for you. One is just a quick one. This is what we ask all of our guests, and it is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received? It could be a line or a phrase or just a concept that you like, wow, this just kind of showed up in my life and it's really made a difference.
Yeah, okay. So this was framed to me as a very like questioning my gender experience piece of advice, but I think it can be extended more broadly. So before I started HRT, I was like, am I trans enough? And this is a question that a lot of trans people ask. It's also a question that like people just ask, am I whatever enough?
Yeah.
And the piece of advice that I got from my partner, who is now my spouse, was this: if you are asking that question, then yes, you are. Just like cis people don't ask that question, or
Right.
people who are already at whatever, they don't ask that question because they don't have to ask that question.
Yeah.
So if you're asking that question, yes, you are. You are enough. Whatever it is, you are queer enough, you are trans enough, you are doing well enough at whatever it is, you count.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for that. I love that. And I know people are going to want to find out more about you, about your organization. So talk to us about where they can find all that.
Yeah. So for the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, our main website is responsiblehomeschooling.org. Our sister website is our Homeschooling's Invisible Children database, which catalogs all of the abuse and fatalities in homeschooling environments that we've been able to find so far, and it's incomplete for obvious data collection reasons. But that is hsinvisibleChildren.org. And CRHE's Twitter handle is at ResponsibleHS, and that's where we are most of the time. We're also on Facebook at Responsible Homeschooling, and I think also Instagram.
Yeah.
And then I am on Twitter at Blue Pup Boy with an I at the end, and I'm on Instagram as MX Darkwater.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know everybody's going to want to check out your work. This has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being with us, Kieryn.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, and everybody, make sure you also check out our social media. We have Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. We'd love to have you follow there. Again, please go ahead and share this show because whether you need it specifically or whether you have somebody on your friend's page, I mean, we all have somebody on our friend's page who's homeschooling, thinking of homeschooling, or maybe as a homeschool alumni who needs some validation. And their organization is going to be super helpful for finding resources, not only for parents thinking of homeschooling, but also for students who are like, okay, now what? This didn't go as I had hoped. What can I do to elevate myself? So that's going to be really important. And then you can also hop on over to our website. You can just go to courage365.org. And just for being a guest on our website, you can download this free ebook called 5 Keys to Living a Life of Courage. This will help you take your next most courageous steps in your healing journey. It's completely free, our gift to you. And while you're at the website, there's a variety of things you can check out there. We have the Need Help tab. Of course, if you are in imminent danger, please call Child Protective Services or call the police if that is applicable. But for other resources, we have a whole resource page on our Need Help section on the website. We also have the backlog of all of our seasons of the Courage Conversation show, so I'd invite you to check that out. And then we actually have a really cool thing that I hope that you've signed up for. This is the Courage Clubs. These are online peer support groups for adult survivors of abuse. We talk about a variety of different topics related to healing with resources. It's a great way to get plugged in with other survivors who get it. It's led by a survivor. Other survivors are there, and it's just a great online community building place. We host Courage Clubs once a month, the first Wednesday of every month. So this is going to be coming up very soon. And all you have to do, it's completely free, is register to join. So you can get the link so you can join the video group. And you can just go to courage365.org/clubs or courage365.org, and you'll see the tab there at the top. One last thing I want to remind you about is we have morning text messages, daily morning text messages. These are empowering, encouraging text messages created by survivors for survivors to kind of get you that shot in the arm in the morning of courage to help you get through your day. We've had so much wonderful feedback from people saying that this has really helped them. And if we've ever missed a day, which doesn't happen often, but on occasion, we have people message us and say, where is our morning text? We need this. And so we are happy to provide this for you. Again, it's completely free from us. All you have to do is take out your phone with me. And at the top part there in the 2, you're going to type out this number, and it is 1-917-809-7311. Pull out your phone. Okay, get ready. I'm going to give you the number one more time. That is 1-917-809-7311. And then in the message area at the bottom, just type the word courage. Just courage. Just one word. Hit submit. When you do that, you'll be automatically added to our morning text message list. You will not get text from other survivors. It'll simply be from us. If you have any questions or want to reach out, that's also a great way to connect with us. But yeah, thank you everybody so much for tuning in today. This has been an amazing conversation. I love hosting the show with so many wonderful guests. Hope you all have a good week and live with courage.